Hi guys. I watched part of the train wreck debate between Sargon, Destiny, Hassan, and Nick Fuentes, I believe. It's the one where Sargon then said that he couldn't sleep afterwards for some reason. And I thought it was a good debate, and I haven't watched it all, just through the first topic. I thought it was a really good debate, and I thought the people on the left were surprisingly cordial and capable of forming at least basic logical arguments. So I do plan on finishing watching it eventually. Now, the interesting part was when, during the first part, Sargon brought up this interesting question: do individuals have moral obligations to the society in which they live in? And apparently, nobody could really answer this question. Yes, it's a tough one. I think even Sargon himself really can't answer this question, and he was really just doing kind of a devil's advocate at that point. So, Sargon, you're probably not going to watch this video, but still, I'm going to attempt to answer it. Now, first, we need to separate out two things: philosophical principle and pragmaticism. We have a philosophical principle that we try to implement into the real world from which we derive our laws, policies, and regulations. But the real world has limitations, which means usually the philosophical principle cannot be fully implemented, and we have to make some compromises in lieu of pragmatism. So, in the form of heuristics. So now we have gotten that out of the way, let's start with the philosophical principle. So keep in mind that at this point, it means that this principle is not restricted by environmental or real world limitations. So not restricted by pragmatism. Okay, so just keep this in mind for now. So in a philosophical principle, does the individual have moral obligations to society that would sacrifice individual liberty? No, absolutely not. Because there can be no higher moral authority than the individual, and there can be no any kind of objective moral justification for an authority who would supersede the individual and his or her liberty. So even when we say, oh, hey, there's this wiser person who just knows better, and what he decides will have a much better outcome for you, it is still under the assumption that you are the reference point, and ultimately it's you who will decide whether that decision is truly right for you or not. If your experience ended up being great sufferings, there can be no grounds to say that superior moral authority is truly superior or not. The thing to keep in mind, which I'm actually quite surprised that nobody seemed to have brought up in the debate, is that in the most naturalistic state of being, given enough resources, there's no individual desire versus the good of the society dichotomy, as the society is made up of individuals. Now, the example given here in the debate is, let's say, individuals not wanting to have children versus the Western civilization is dying as a result. But the error that has been made is that that desire is not an absolute temporal thing. There can be short-term desires and long-term desires. For example, let's say a guy loves to binge drink, and if he doesn't drink, he suffers. So he has this great desire, great need to drink. So this would be like an immediate short-term desire. But let's say that he goes to the doctor, and the doctor tells him, if you keep this up, your liver is going to fail. So then this individual would need to make a decision. Does he want to keep to his immediate desire, or does he want to eventually face the very high probability that his liver is going to fail? If he decides that, no, I really don't want my liver to fail, therefore I'm going to stop drinking, that would be sacrificing an immediate desire for the long-term effect. But ultimately, it's his decision, the decision that would rest upon his choice and desire, not another moral authority. So similarly, a person not wanting children may be an immediate desire. Like you know what, right now I really don't want children. I don't see myself having children, and I also don't see myself wanting to have children anytime soon. But he's been informed then that not doing that, not having children, will have an impact on Western civilization disappearing. Again, whether this is actually true or not is up to debate, but let's just assume for the sake of the argument that that's actually the case. He then needs to make this decision. Does he want to keep to his immediate desire or see the long-term effect of the Western civilization disappearing? And he needs to weigh the cost and benefit of his decision. My general contention is that as long as the individual is given all of the information, or at least enough information to make informed choices, the individuals in a society will make the most naturalistic decision. So, for example, recognizing that it is the Western civilization which has given them the condition to not have children and still live a very good life. So therefore, they would want to preserve it, generally speaking. To bolster this point, under the condition of unlimited resources, the individual will effectively become his or her society, because every individual would then effectively has his or her own universe that they alone will decide to share or not share with whomever they choose. So from a philosophical point of view, the individual's desire are not separate from the desire of the society. Under unlimited resources, without environmental constraints, they are one and the same. Okay, so now let's talk about pragmatism. So, unfortunately, we do live in a world of not just limited resources, but extremely limited resources. We simply cannot guarantee 100% every person's individual liberty. And in fact, pretty far from it. So heuristics would have to be given, and the first heuristic will be the heuristic of the majority. So we cannot guarantee that we can accommodate every individual's desires and choices. Then we must find an optimal number, which means the maximum number of individuals we can accommodate. And well, there just isn't a better heuristic that anyone can come up with right now than the majority. Now, keep in mind that majority could mean a number of things. It doesn't have to mean 50.000000001%. It could be 60%, it could be 70%. We can gather data and build a best fit model for the most optimal a priori percentage. But this would be the best heuristic. This would imply that the desires of the minority would many times need to conform to desires of the majority to various extent. And Sargon has brought up several examples of this. For example, throwing out the trash, not spitting on the sidewalk, stop at the red light, etc., etc. All of this would mean that it works for the happiness of the majority. Now, at this point, I know people would immediately think about, well, wouldn't this mean minorities get oppressed? Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by oppressed, because a behavior isn't just good or bad. They're not perceived to be just good or bad. There are degrees of good and degrees of bad, and there are degrees to reward certain various degrees of good behavior and vice versa. So, for example, getting yourself drunk on a regular basis is deemed to be a negative behavior for the most part. But it's such a minute offense that people will just shrug their shoulders. We're not going to throw them in jail, for example. So just because people who get themselves drunk know and feel that there is a social pressure, a societal pressure against getting yourself drunk, does that mean that he feels oppressed? Well, not necessarily, because it's so minuscule that it's almost like nothing. It's like almost nothing. Now, there are other things, like, for example, not having children. And yes, the majority might decide that it's just not a desirable behavior. But the majority then would need to weigh the cost and benefits. For example, these people having children might only make the majority feel slightly better or make the condition of the majority slightly better, but may detriment those people so badly that they can no longer be functional people in society, which has implications in workplace, in social relations, etc., etc. So that could potentially have a much more negative consequence than the slight positive consequence of having children for the majority. So again, the important thing here is making informed choices and weigh the costs and benefits. It's like I always say, you have to take the good with the bad and weigh your choices before making them. Of course, people would then ask, okay, but how about, let's say, slavery? What if the majority desires slavery and the only people whose liberty will be taken away are the minority slaves? Now, keep in mind that this question by itself goes into the realm of pragmatism, right? Because slavery is the result of limited resources. It is a historic strategy to gain quite a lot of resources under a short amount of time. So then I'm going to answer in the sense of pragmatism. So I, as an individual, may feel completely repulsed by it, but once again, I, as an individual, still have no moral authority to supersede the majority individuals. So yes, if all the individuals in our society have given all of the information needed from all perspectives, and the majority of them still freely make the choice to have slavery, then slavery stays. There's no other way. I tend to, however, think that tend to not be the case, because one of the reasons why we tend to be so repulsed by things such as slavery or genocide or mass torture is because these things go against the naturalistic tendencies of having individual liberty. So here, I'm not saying that these things are unnatural. I'm saying that if an individual is well informed of all the costs and benefits of these actions, vast majority of them would not choose them. They have implications of going against natural human empathy, for one, which is, for example, why the Holocaust needed to be conducted in secret. It's also why, despite the fact that slavery was an ubiquitous thing, the West eventually championed to end it. If not for humanistic reasons, for economic reasons, as slavery is also economically unsustainable. And having genocide or slavery generally would require an authoritarian government that can go against the wishes of the majority and or keeping the information away from the public for their own agenda. So these things are very, very bad because generally speaking, most individuals have weighed the costs and benefits and have decided that the costs greatly outweigh the benefits when they're being informed enough. Now finally, I know that Sargon brought this up due to the urgency of the West losing Western civilization to mass immigration, and the birth rates was one of the things that kept being brought up. Keep in mind, however, that this mass immigration is imposed upon the Western countries by authoritarian powers, so it is not naturalistic, and Sargon has also brought this up a number of times. I think despite the dropping birth rates, most people in the West do not want Western civilization to go away and do not want mass immigration, especially if they are informed enough of all the consequences it will bring. So this example does not somehow go against the principle of individual liberty. However, let's say for some strange reason, most people in the West really just don't care about the Western civilization or are repulsed by it, so Western civilization disappears, or let's just say that most people are repulsed by humanity in general. Humanity continue on Earth, so they chose under all considerations to stop procreating. Then yes, Western civilization should disappear, humanity should disappear. Now, Sargon might say, you know what, I disagree with that. Even if 99.9999999% of the people want humanity to vanish, I still think an individual has the moral obligation to procreate and continue humanity. Then we would definitely disagree, because you as the only individual with this desire has no moral authority to determine that over anybody else. Also, in the context of cultural change and population change, keep in mind that this has always happened throughout human history. Naturalistically speaking, cultures would change over time. Doesn't matter what happens, population also would change over time. Those things tend to be the default to begin with. If you say, hey, Western civilization deserves to be preserved, what is the justification then to say, but the Islamic culture doesn't need to be preserved? We cannot determine that by simply using the principle of a person just has moral obligations to his or her society, because the Muslim immigrants are preserving their culture also when they move to the West. And then there are Muslim immigrants who decided to adopt the Western culture and stop being a Muslim. And how do we determine then why the former is bad but the latter is good, other than liberal desires of the individual and the heuristic of the majority? I mean, who knows? Maybe one day, for some reason, the Islamic culture became more desirable than the Christian Western culture for the vast majority of Westerners. You know, kind of like how the Germanic people decided that the Christian Roman culture was more desirable than their pagan barbarian culture. So they changed and adopted the Christian Roman culture. Should they not have done that, instead be forced to keep onto their Germanic pagan culture? And if every culture were to be preserved just for the sake of preserving as a moral obligation, we would stop having progress, period. I'm not pro mass immigration, by the way, for anybody who wants to accuse me of being a leftist. I'm saying that the reason why you are repulsed by mass immigration and want to preserve Western civilization is because of your own individual liberty and choice, and that is the principle to begin with, that we are trying to optimize. So I hope this answers the question, and see you next time.